This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory.
It's interesting. Today is considered Earth Day, and one day out of the year we look at it from that perspective, but I think we should have Earth Day every single day because that's where our future is coming from. So I'm going to, as we begin today, offer a prayer to our Creator, that the words that we say and the actions that we do will coincide so that we can help the next generations to come. So if you don't mind, I'm going to ask if you stand for a second, and I'm going to offer some words in the language that residential schools told my parents would never be worth anything. And the words that they were told to forget was something that they did. So I was very lucky to be around elders who gave me some direction and said that that language that Creator gave us is really inside of our hearts, and we'll never lose it. We just have to find a way to inspire ourselves to use it. So I've been doing that, and I'd like to offer a prayer in this manner. Bujo Myeengun dejnikas deshkan zibi donjiba Myeengun dodem ketche manado chimigwech binwak kina mashkiki osama wingashk mashko de wish min wigijik ketche manado chimigwech minwak kina mino bamadaziwen ketche manado chimigwech minwa kina mampi ganajuan gijgat nungum. Just want to say thank you to our Creator for all that we've been given, the medicines, this beautiful day, and the teachings that we hope we'll have in our heart forever. Miigwech. So with that said, my name is Myeengun. I come from Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, just outside London, Ontario. And it's been a busy couple years for our nation as we've turned a battle that we've seen in our community into something that we've found allies a link to. We found that there was a challenge presented to us that we, I guess over the years that we went to residential school, we weren't even aware of. Right up to the 70s when a pipeline was put in the ground from Sarnia to Montreal, our nation was never a part of that process. And we, over the last few years, have been dealing with Canada on recognition of our traditional lands, our traditional territories, our ancestral lands that we've lived on since time immemorial. And during that time of getting that acknowledgement from our own people and from governments, that we identified the southern parts of Ontario to be where we've lived forever and ever. And in that territory, we found that there was activities going on that wasn't, I guess, comfortable with us when it comes to running pipelines through our territory without our acknowledgement. So we're very fortunate back in the mid-'80s when Canada was repatriating the Constitution back to Canada. One of the elected leaders at the time was Mr. Del Riley. He was the Grand Chief of the National Indian Brotherhood, which ultimately turned into the Assembly of First Nations. And during those struggles with the senior Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, we had a battle of getting our recognition within the Constitution of Canada. And with the efforts of Mr. Del Riley and many others, we got put into the Constitution of Canada, Section 35, which is a portion of the Constitution that recognizes traditional territories. And within the wording of that, there's a part that talks about the consultation process of governments when it comes to First Nation territories. So if they're going to do something on territories, they need to consult with First Nations. And that's been put into the Canadian Constitution and challenged a few times in courts over what that really means, because we haven't actually determined that to a degree where they felt that they needed to consult with us, especially on energy projects. So when Canada elected to build a organ or a group of people to look at the possibility of pipelines, they developed the National Energy Board, and the National Energy Board was given the authority to look at the possibility of approving pipelines. We know that that became the sticky point in the Line 9 fight that we are doing with Enbridge right now. We found out that the consultation piece that was given to the National Energy Board was unconstitutional. It didn't have the authority to approve pipelines in our traditional territory. So we challenged that. We told them that there was a nation-to-nation relationship with Canada that we wanted to, I guess, talk to them about when it comes to pipelines. So in the mid-70s, when that pipeline was put in, there was no consultation with Chippewas of the Thames First Nation. It was built, and it ran light crude oil for a number of years. This light crude oil was at some point changed to run bitumen oil through it, and that approval came from the National Energy Board. So Chippewas, the Thames First Nation, decided to challenge this, and we found out that Canada has never consulted Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, even though we've asked them to. We've sent emails, we phoned Canada, and to sit down and talk about what we felt would have been the dangerous part of running bitumen oil through our territory. They neglected to follow up on any of our emails. They neglected to give us a call back, and they kept referring back to the National Energy Board to make that decision. We got upset about that. We decided that we would, if they're not going to talk to us, then we're going to have to send lawyers to them and make this a legal issue. And which we did. We took it to court. We took it to the Federal Court of Appeals, and there was 3 judges that decided on our case about consultation. During those court proceedings, we found out that 2 of the judges decided that we were consulted well enough, and 1 judge dissented from that decision. We were kind of let down that we thought it was a pretty much open and shut case, that obviously there was no consultation, but the judge's ruling went forward. And we decided to take it a step further at that point, with the help of the dissenting judge's observation that we could actually go to the Supreme Court of Canada, and which we did, and we had enough evidence to go to the Supreme Court of Canada on trying to stop Line 9 from delivering tar sands oil through this region. And so that's where we stand today, waiting for a decision from the November 30th court battle. One of the biggest issues that we had with that is if you've ever attempted to go to the Supreme Court of Canada, most Canadians wouldn't be able to afford that. We found out it's about $170,000 for 1 day to go to the Supreme Court of Canada. It's a very expensive risk to take if you're going to do that, and that's why you find a lot of communities not willing to do that. The risk that we took as a nation, we're feeling it now, because it wasn't just the court costs of that day, it was the cost of the Federal Court of Appeals and all the other work that we had to do. If you take into consideration the amount of staff that we had to put on this, the band counselors that had to do their work, it's an insurmountable amount of money to battle this court issue. And we know that with this risk, we're willing to do this risk because we think that this pipeline will erupt within the next 2 years, because we had the engineering reports of this pipeline, and the pipeline is 40 years old. It had a life expectancy of 40 years when it was put into the ground, and now it's 40 years later, and now they want to put in a worse type of oil and in more capacity. So they want to put up the amount of oil flowing through that line from 240,000 barrels per day to 300,000, which means more pressure on that line, and it's going to break someplace. That line travels right through Toronto, right by, I think it's a Finch subway station, that could be in a very dangerous position. We've notified many of the people, especially daycares and schools, where that pipeline sits right today, where the chances of that breaking is pretty high. And we can't understand why, you know, we could be omitted in these conversations, because we calculated over 40 years the amount of money that traveled through these pipelines without consultation, and we even calculated how much every municipality was given in tax, you know, or they taxed that line, and it's a tremendous amount of money. Not one penny went to First Nations, even though it traveled through our traditional territories. So just the obligation of a corporation like that to not even acknowledge First Nations was, to us, really, really, really appalling. I think it's really dangerous that we have this oil running through our territory today, and that it continues to be running through illegally today without our court case even being announced yet, or they started running that pipeline with tar sands oil in it. And we don't think that's right. We think most Canadians would and should probably feel uncomfortable about their government not even honoring the Constitution of Canada. And that's what we challenged them in court over, that it is in Section 35, the duty to consult, and Canada did acknowledge that they did not consult with us. And it was interesting at the Supreme Court on November 30th that when the question to the Crown attorneys there, or the judges there, who actually is the Crown of Canada? And they looked at each other, and nobody can answer that question. Like, there's a misunderstanding of who actually the Crown is in this country. You know. So it's been these types of events that lead us to say, you know, there's got to be some support in this from Canadians, that, you know, Canada has to do their part to ensure our safety. The water that we drink and everything that we rely on for food sustenance, you know, is compromised when one of these pipelines breaks. And you only have to go back as far as 2010 in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where you see land that's still devastated, and I don't think we'll ever see food or water clean in that area again. Then you're seeing the allies and the friendships of us fighting this battle, and maybe many of you are aware of what happened in North Dakota over the last year with Standing Rock. What do you do as a nation if the Supreme Court of Canada, highest court in this country, decides against you, even though you have to fight for the safety of our water? Do we just give up? Do we just say, well, we lost it in court? Chippewas, the Thames First Nation, has decided not to do that. We decided that the court process that we are going through will be an avenue to try to help our future generations have clean water. But if a negative decision comes out of the Supreme Court, we're not just going to sit back and say we lost. And the reason I said that is because that's really how Standing Rock got started. People decided to stand up on their own to protect the water. Unfortunately, you've seen what took place there, but we're not going to stand back and sit idle over anything to do with our future generations. And that's not just an Indigenous issue. It's a human issue here in this country. We need to think about our future generations and whether they have clean food and water so that they can survive too. So I think when we take on this battle, we want to make sure that people are at least understand the issue of all these wrongs can't make a right. You know, you can't neglect the Constitution, you can't neglect treaty rights, and you can't neglect the future of our children. These three alignments is what's, I guess, given us the spirit to fight we're going to take this to wherever it needs to go. If we have a win in our court, that's probably the best route right now. But if we have a loss in this court, then we have to stand up, and that's the part that's going to hurt, because we've seen what happened when First Nations stand up. There's laws now that talk about, I guess, these types of gatherings, and I think we're going to challenge those too, because the way that we need to battle this is to align many of the grassroots people in this country to know that this is an issue that's not just here at Southern Ontario, but across the nation and across the world right now. That we have to find alternatives to the energy sources that they're supplying right now. These oil industries are polluting the earth. They're doing so much danger to our sustenance that if we don't do anything, then we risk a very big loss, not in our own generation, but future generations to come. And we can't allow that to happen. Native people's spirituality to the land is front and foremost and will always be the reason that we'll stand up against corporations and governments for that purpose. So First Nation people, I think, in Canada are coming out of the residential school days, now getting themselves acquainted with these issues and are aligning together with allies such as yourself to force these governments to make better decisions. The meeting that went on in the United States with Trump and our Prime Minister led to the first executive order that Trump did was to open up the pipeline and get rid of the Native people from that region. We don't want that to continue. We want to make sure that they know that this is something that we're serious about, and we'll take every step that's necessary to protect our future generations. So I want to thank you for listening to me and being a part of this evening with you. Chimwech.